You ever walk into a room and feel the temperature drop? Not because you said anything, not because you did anything, but because they felt something. Yeah, that's the moment they realized the game changed, and they weren't the ones holding the cards anymore. See, they love calling people crazy when they can't predict them. They call it irrational, unstable, dangerous. But what they really mean is uncontrollable. And nothing terrifies a room full of so-called strategists more than someone they can't calculate. Someone who smiles while they're building 10 different backup plans. Someone who listens more than they talk and thinks 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still arguing about move 1. They thought you were just another piece on the board, just another name on a file, just another person they could study, pressure, and eventually corner. Oh, they had their charts, their little meetings, their whispers behind closed doors. Watch this one. Test this one. Apply pressure here. But something went wrong, didn't it? Because while they were busy studying you, you were busy studying them. While they were planning traps, you were mapping exits. While they were trying to figure out your next move, you were figuring out their patterns. And the funny thing about people who think they're the smartest in the room is they get very comfortable, very predictable, very blind. That's when tactical insanity begins. Not the kind they show in movies. Not screaming chaos. Not random destruction. No, the dangerous kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you let people underestimate you on purpose. The kind where you let them think they're winning until the moment they realize they were following a script you understood from page 1. And now? Now they're confused. Because you didn't react the way they expected. You didn't break where they applied pressure. You didn't panic where they set fear. You didn't even defend yourself the way normal people do. You just adapted, smiled, adjusted one small detail, and suddenly their whole strategy started collapsing like a cheap house of cards. Now they're asking each other questions. Did we miscalculate? Who told him? How did he see that coming? And the best part, you didn't outmuscle them. You didn't outrank them. You didn't outspend them. You just outthought them. Because real chaos isn't being loud. Real chaos is being 5 steps ahead while looking completely harmless. Real madness is turning pressure into information, turning attacks into data, turning their own strategies into the very reason they lose sleep at night. So now they sit in their little war room, staring at reports, replaying conversations, trying to find the exact moment things slipped out of their control. And the truth, it slipped the moment they assumed you were normal. Tonight we're going to talk about something they never prepare for. Something no strategy manual teaches. Something that makes entire groups of planners nervous. Tactical insanity. The art of thinking differently when everyone expects you to think the same. The power of controlled unpredictability. The silent psychology of letting people defeat themselves while they think they're studying you. Because sometimes the person they call the most dangerous is just the one who finally understood the rules of the game. They started using that word about you very carefully at first. Unpredictable. At the beginning it sounded like an accusation, like something was wrong with you. Like you weren't following the script everyone else silently agreed to follow. People like systems. They like patterns. They like knowing that if they push here, you'll move there. If they ignore you, you'll chase. If they pressure you, you'll break. That's how most social games work. Simple cause and effect. Safe. Measurable. Boring. But you didn't move when they pushed. You didn't react when they expected noise. You didn't explain yourself when they were waiting for explanations. And that's when the whispers started. Something is off. Why didn't they react? What are they planning? Funny thing is, you weren't even trying to be mysterious. You just stopped giving free reactions. You stopped performing emotional theater for people who were taking notes instead of caring. And when you stop reacting the way people expect, their confidence starts to crack, because predictable minds survive on predictable responses. They know how to handle anger. They respond with defense. They know how to handle fear. They respond with control. They know how to handle ego. They respond with competition. But calm observation, silence, delayed reactions, that makes people nervous. You see, most people think intelligence is about having answers. No, real intelligence is about watching patterns. Watching how people behave when they think no one is measuring them. Watching how quickly respect disappears when they think you have no power. Watching how fast smiles turn into strategies when they think you're not paying attention. And you paid attention. You noticed how some people only supported you when it benefited them. You noticed how some only contacted you when they needed something. You noticed how quickly doubt spread the moment you stopped explaining your every move. That's when you understood something dangerous. Most people don't fear aggression. They fear what they can't map. So you became harder to map. Not by lying, not by pretending, but by becoming disciplined with your reactions. You started choosing when to speak, choosing when to show emotion, choosing when to reveal plans. That alone makes people uncomfortable because they lose their favorite weapon, predictability. Because when someone knows your emotional buttons, they own a remote control to your behavior. And you quietly took the batteries out. Now they couldn't tell if you were angry or just thinking. They couldn't tell if you were losing or just waiting. They couldn't tell if you knew something or if you were just calm under pressure. And that uncertainty started creating stories in their heads. Humans hate information gaps. When they don't know your intentions, they invent them. When they don't know your plan, they assume the worst. When they can't predict your reaction, they start overestimating you. That's when unpredictable stopped being an insult and started becoming your armor. Because the truth is, you didn't become random. You became selective. There's a difference. Random is chaos without purpose. Tactical unpredictability is discipline with timing. You reacted when it mattered and ignored what was designed to drain you. That's when something interesting happened. The same people who once tried to read you started becoming careful around you. Their jokes became measured. Their comments became softer. Their strategies became quieter. Because now they weren't sure what you noticed. And nothing makes a predictable mind more uncomfortable than someone who might be observing their patterns. You started seeing how quickly confidence disappears when someone loses psychological advantage. How loud people become quiet when they can't guess your next move. How people who once tried to provoke you suddenly try to stay neutral because they can't trigger the reaction they rehearsed. And the irony. You didn't become dangerous because you attacked anyone. You became dangerous because you became self-controlled. That's the part nobody talks about. The Joker isn't dangerous because he's loud. He's dangerous because he understands human behavior without being controlled by it. He knows most people are trapped inside their own habits. Same reactions, same fears, same need to feel superior, same panic when control slips away. And when you step outside that predictable loop, you look insane to people still trapped inside it. They call it strange when you stay calm where they would panic. They call it cold when you stay silent where they would argue. They call it arrogance when you stop proving yourself. But what they're really seeing is someone who stopped playing emotional checkers and started playing psychological chess. You realized not every attack deserves a response. Not every opinion deserves energy. Not every challenge deserves participation. And once you understand that, you stop being easy to manipulate. Because manipulation requires emotional predictability. If they know you must defend your reputation, they attack it. If they know you must win arguments, they provoke debates. If they know you must be liked, they threaten exclusion. But when you become comfortable with silence, with observation, with patience, those tactics start failing one by one. That's when they say it again. They're unpredictable. And this time, it doesn't sound like criticism. It sounds like caution. While they were busy plotting against you, drawing their charts, setting their traps, whispering in corners about how to push you to your breaking point, you were quietly turning all of that energy into your advantage. They didn't realize it at the time, but every move they made, every tactic they deployed, every attempt to corner you, only gave you more information, more insight, more clarity about how their minds worked. They believed they were the hunters, but in reality, they were handing you the map of their own weaknesses while thinking you were the prey. They tested your patience, trying to provoke an emotional response, hoping to see fear, hesitation, or anger. They were counting on predictable reactions, the kind most people give when under pressure. But you weren't most people. You didn't play by their rules, and that's where the power shifted. Each whisper, each subtle threat, each manipulative suggestion became a piece of the puzzle. While they thought they were confusing you, you were decoding them. They showed their patterns in the way they positioned themselves, in the timing of their comments, in the sequence of their attacks. You noticed the ones who only spoke when it served their ego, the ones who pushed hardest when they thought they could get a rise out of you, the ones who tried to control the conversation by creating noise and distraction. Every move they made was a lesson in human behavior. Every attempt to pressure you was a clue, and you absorbed it all like a sponge. You saw the cracks forming in their confidence, the hesitation in their eyes, the brief flickers of uncertainty that most people fail to notice because they are too busy reacting. And while they were measuring and calculating how to control you, you were doing the exact opposite. You weren't being reactive, you were being strategic. You learned when to speak, when to stay silent, when to let things play out, and when to nudge situations subtly in your favor. You turned their aggression into observation, their manipulation into data, their assumptions into knowledge. Every attempt to destabilize you became a source of power. The more they pressed, the more information you collected. The more they tried to predict your moves, the more unpredictable you became by design, not by chance. You created a rhythm that they couldn't follow because they expected chaos, not calm, panic, not patience, confusion, not calculation. It was beautiful in a dark way. While they were plotting what they thought was a decisive victory, they were unknowingly scripting their own exposure. Each meeting, each conversation, each strategy session provided you with insights into their fears, their motivations, their overconfidence, and their blind spots. You could see who overestimated themselves, who underestimated you, and who relied too heavily on rules that no longer applied. They thought they were creating pressure, but every attempt to push you harder was simply sharpening your perception. They revealed themselves in ways they never intended, and you noticed every little thing. Every gesture, every pause, every subtle inflection became a piece of the map you were quietly assembling. And then the moment arrived, as it always does, when the invisible shift occurred. They had built their own war room, their own complex web of tactics, thinking they were orchestrating your downfall. But you had been orchestrating something else entirely. Something quiet, invisible and far more effective. While they were consumed with controlling you, you had already taken control of them. Not overtly, not with noise or aggression, but with insight, observation, and mental discipline. They didn't realize that every attempt to outsmart you had already been transformed into a strategic advantage. Every tactic aimed at destabilizing you became a tool for understanding them, anticipating them, predicting their next move, before they even knew what it was themselves. The beauty of it lies in the subtlety. They think winning requires force, domination, or direct confrontation, but the real victory comes from patience, analysis, and the quiet collection of intelligence while they assume they are in control. They never notice the quiet mind moving through the storm they create. They never realize that while they are shouting and pushing, you are thinking 5 steps ahead, using their own momentum against them. You become untouchable, not because you are stronger, faster, or louder, but because you are calmer, smarter, and fully aware of the psychology behind every move. Their attacks, designed to break you, instead become the very reasons you rise above them. By the time they recognize it, it's too late. The energy they spent trying to manipulate you, control you, and corner you has already fueled your advantage. They're confused, uncertain, and off balance. Their strategies crumble because they never accounted for the quiet observer who wasn't reacting. They were learning, absorbing, adapting. They thought they were shaping your actions, but in reality, you were shaping their perceptions. Their efforts to pressure you now only highlight their vulnerabilities. And all of this, it happened while they were convinced they were winning, while they were convinced you were under their control, while they were convinced they were the hunters. What they failed to see is that true power doesn't come from confrontation, from noise, from trying to dominate a room or a situation. True power comes from understanding, from patience, from turning every attack into insight, from quietly mapping the battlefield, while everyone else assumes they are controlling it. That's why tactical insanity is so terrifying to those who think they understand the game. They aren't afraid of you because you strike. They're afraid because you see, because you calculate, because you convert every challenge into leverage, every move into advantage, and every expectation into something they didn't predict. And that's when the tables turn, the war room collapses, and they finally realize they've been outsmarted not by force, but by the silent intelligence they never saw coming. Victory isn't always about crushing someone under your weight or dominating the room with volume or authority. Sometimes the real victory is subtler, almost invisible, and that's what makes it terrifying for them. They believed that control meant bending you to their will, that strategy meant forcing you into predictable responses, that intelligence meant outthinking you in obvious ways. But the moment they started trying to manipulate the conversation, shape your reactions, and corner your decisions, they unknowingly handed you the blueprint to dismantle their own confidence. They didn't see it because they were too busy expecting drama, too busy expecting resistance, too busy expecting normal reactions. And that's where the advantage hides, between what they expect and what actually happens. While they focused on outcomes they thought they could enforce, you focused on processes, on understanding motives, on recognizing weaknesses. You watched how they overcomplicated simple situations, how they relied on assumptions instead of observation, how their pride blinded them to the smallest signs of miscalculation. You listened to the tone behind words, the hesitation before decisions, the nervous laughter masking insecurity. They were building castles of strategy, stacking every plan carefully, thinking they were safe behind walls of logic and procedure. And you watched quietly as cracks appeared between the stones. Each misstep, each small reveal, Each subtle slip became data points, patterns to exploit, a quiet map to navigate the chaos they thought they controlled. They were confident because confidence is contagious, and people in groups feed off one another's certainty. They believed their war room, their carefully curated charts, their whispered alliances, and their rehearsed arguments gave them an edge. But confidence without awareness is fragile, and fragile confidence is something that can be shattered without ever touching it. You didn't attack. You didn't shout. You didn't provoke. You observed. You calculated. You let them make the mistakes they couldn't even see themselves making. Every assumption they made about your behavior, every expectation they projected onto you, became another brick in the very trap they were constructing. They assumed you were predictable. They assumed you would panic. They assumed you would overreact. And those assumptions were fatal because they were wrong. The beauty of the whole process lies in the illusion of control. They believed they were in charge, that they were the hunters, and that they were orchestrating the game. But the real game was invisible to them while they were performing. You were reading the script, memorizing their cues, understanding the rhythm of their decisions, and identifying the weak links in their chain. You allowed them to think they were winning, allowed them to build their confidence, allowed them to underestimate you. That's what makes the eventual realization so devastating. When people realize they were outmaneuvered without noticing it, it feels like the floor dropped beneath them, like the rules they relied upon were lies, like the world they thought they controlled slipped through their fingers. Psychological advantage doesn't always need a dramatic reveal. Sometimes it's just a quiet shift, a subtle realignment, an awareness that the other side doesn't have. They are looking for conflict, for noise, for chaos, while you're operating on an entirely different plane. You're calculating, assessing, adapting, while they're still trying to predict your first move. And every time they make a decision based on flawed assumptions, every time they misread the signs, you accumulate leverage. Every tiny victory becomes part of a larger strategy, and eventually, those small wins compound until the structure they thought was secure begins to crumble. They start doubting themselves. First, it's a small hesitation, a brief pause before a statement, a flicker of uncertainty in a confident tone. Then it grows. Conversations that used to flow smoothly now feel heavier, slower, more tentative. Strategies that used to work suddenly fail. Plans that seemed infallible now collapse at the slightest pressure. And they don't know why. They can't understand what happened because their minds are trapped in the logic they rely upon, unable to grasp the quiet intelligence that doesn't play by those rules. Every miscalculation they make, every overreach, every moment of confusion reinforces your position without you ever having to fight directly. And that's the art of victory they fear. It's not visible in the traditional sense. It's not the loudest voice in the room, the most aggressive tactic, the most flamboyant display. It's the invisible shift in perception, the quiet confidence that undercuts theirs, the knowledge that you can act when they cannot anticipate your actions, the awareness that allows you to stay 10 steps ahead while they stumble through their own miscalculations. They lose control not because you took it from them, but because you never allowed them to fully hold it in the first place. By the time they recognize it, panic and doubt have already set in. They replay conversations, meetings, and actions, trying to find the exact moment they fell behind. They question themselves, second-guess decisions, and feel the sting of uncertainty for the first time in a long while. And all the while, you remain calm, measured, and unshaken, because you've understood something they haven't. The real battlefield isn't the room, the charts, or the plans. The real battlefield is the mind. the moment you gain control of perception, the moment you manipulate assumptions and expectations, the moment you turn their energy into your advantage. That's when victory becomes inevitable, without a single overt confrontation. You see, most people think power comes from brute force, authority, or the loudest voice in the room. But the truth is far more subtle, far more dangerous. Real influence comes from patience, observation, and the quiet mastery of timing. You don't need to raise your voice or dominate a conversation to win. In fact, doing so often reveals more about your strategy than you intend. They assume that aggression equals control, that noise equals dominance, that fast reactions equal intelligence. But you learned early on that the mind is the true battlefield, and control over it cannot be forced. It must be earned, cultivated, and manipulated carefully. And when they underestimate that, when they believe that only outward action matters, that's when the real advantage reveals itself. They were obsessed with outcomes, with scoring points, with proving superiority. They were focused on making the room react, on testing your limits, on forcing concessions. But while they were busy projecting power, you were collecting intelligence. You noticed the patterns, the small tells, the pauses before they spoke, the subtle shifts in tone when they thought they were being clever. Every attempt to pressure you was a lesson in human behavior, a map of the mind they thought they controlled, but were really revealing. You weren't reacting to them. You were observing them, understanding them, and quietly guiding the energy in ways they didn't realize. Their power became fuel for your strategy, their overconfidence became a weapon, and their attempts at intimidation became data points you could exploit. And it's in that quiet observation that real tactical genius emerges. You understood that not every fight needs to be fought, that not every challenge needs a response, that not every provocation deserves attention. You learned to measure each situation, to recognize which moves were worth engaging with and which could be allowed to pass. And in doing so, you created a space where they could act freely, unaware that their freedom was feeding your insight. They believed they were controlling the pace, shaping the dialogue, and steering the decisions, but in reality, they were exposing themselves, revealing weaknesses, and giving you the upper hand without realizing it. Every step they took toward dominance only confirmed your understanding of their patterns, their limitations, and their psychological vulnerabilities. You realize that patience is a form of power, that staying silent in the right moments communicates more than words ever could, that withholding reaction in a room full of people expecting chaos creates tension, uncertainty, and doubt. They were looking for explosive responses, dramatic confrontations, overt displays of strength, but you understood that real power is invisible until it manifests in the outcome. By choosing when and how to act, you became the one setting the tempo, the one defining the boundaries, the one whose presence alone shifted the room. And the funny thing is, they didn't even notice it happening. They only felt the effects after the fact, scrambling to regain composure, replaying interactions in their heads, trying to find the moment they lost the psychological advantage. There's a kind of terrifying elegance in this kind of victory. It's not loud, it's not flashy, and it's certainly not understood by those who rely on conventional measures of control. They think leadership is about command and direction, but leadership can also be about subtle influence, about shaping perceptions, about guiding decisions from the shadows. They attempt to pressure you, because they believe that pressure creates weakness. But you've learned that it can instead create clarity, sharpen instincts, and expose the fragility in others. Every calculated pause, every measured word, every careful decision compounds the effect, and suddenly, the people who were certain of their superiority are left questioning themselves, unsure of their own judgments, afraid to commit to choices they would normally make without hesitation. And while they scramble, while they second-guess, while they stumble over their own strategies, you remain steady. You are the eye of the storm, calm, collected, and entirely aware of the dynamics at play. You don't need to overpower them to win. You only need to understand the rhythm, anticipate the moves, and subtly guide outcomes in your favor. They are reacting, improvising, trying to regain control, while you are acting with foresight, precision, and quiet authority. Their own energy is bending toward your advantage, and they don't even realize it. Every attempt to manipulate, dominate, or unsettle you becomes evidence of their own overconfidence, their own predictability, and their own vulnerability. And that's the point they fail to understand. They believe power is loud, direct, and visible, but you know it is quiet, indirect, and psychological. You win not by force, but by control over perception, by mastery of timing, by turning every attack into insight, every expectation into leverage, and every assumption into an advantage. While they think they are shaping your actions, you are shaping theirs. And the terrifying reality for them is that by the time they realize it, the shift has already occurred, the advantage is already yours, and the room they thought they commanded is now moving to the rhythm you set without even knowing it. They believed they were running the experiment, that every test, every question, every small push was a measure of your limits. They thought they were observing, controlling, calculating, while you were simply participating quietly, almost innocently, while absorbing everything. They didn't see it, of course, because it's hard to notice when someone is calm, seemingly compliant, and unobtrusive. That's the beauty of tactical observation. They assume you are the subject, the one being measured, the one on display, and all the while, you are the one watching them. Every whisper, every glance, every strategy session becomes a window into their priorities, their fears, their overconfidence, and their assumptions. They handed you the information they didn't even know they were sharing, piece by piece, like crumbs leading straight to the truth of how they think and operate. They tested you in ways designed to create reactions, designed to provoke mistakes, designed to push you into predictable behavior. But you weren't predictable. You weren't reacting the way they expected. You didn't panic. You didn't over-explain. You didn't even defend yourself when it would have been easy to do so. You simply observed, noted, and absorbed, turning their own energy into fuel for your understanding. The very intensity they directed at you became the tool that allowed you to map their weaknesses. They were trying to see if you would break, but all they were doing was revealing cracks in their own armor. Every attempt to manipulate you exposed their patterns, highlighted their blind spots, and created opportunities you could exploit when the moment was right. The experiment they thought they were running never belonged to them. Every controlled variable they tried to introduce became an insight for you. Every pressure point they applied became data. Every attempt at intimidation became a lesson in human behavior, giving you a clear understanding of who relied on overconfidence, who depended on rules, and who only followed the herd. And while they assumed they were the architects of the plan, they were unknowingly playing into your hands. By focusing on the wrong metrics, your immediate reactions, your expressions, your words, they ignored the underlying fact that observation itself is power. Watching, listening, and understanding without revealing intent is far more dangerous than any overt action. They expected you to respond in predictable ways, to show frustration, to argue, to flinch. Instead, you responded with calculated stillness, subtle observation, and the quiet collection of information. And in that stillness, you gained control. You could see which individuals were impulsive, which relied too heavily on assumptions, which attempted to manipulate others for their own advantage. You noticed the smallest inconsistencies, the faintest signs of doubt, the hesitation behind confident statements. All of this became part of the mental map you were constructing. Every seemingly minor interaction was a clue, every subtle move a piece of the larger puzzle. And the irony is that while they were convinced they were controlling the experiment, they were revealing more about themselves than you ever would. This is what makes the power so insidious. The people who believe they are testing you are, in fact, being tested themselves. Their every action, their every attempt to measure, to manipulate, to provoke, feeds your understanding and gives you a strategic advantage they will only recognize when it is too late. And it isn't just about collecting information. It's about patience, discipline, and timing. You don't reveal your insight until the moment it has the maximum effect. You don't confront, you don't attack, you don't announce your understanding. You wait. You allow them to continue, unknowingly building the very scenario that will expose their flaws, highlight their overconfidence, and collapse their assumed control. Every moment they act as though they are in charge strengthens your eventual position. The beauty of this approach is that it turns conventional power on its head. They believe that control requires domination, that intelligence requires action, that influence requires assertion, but you know the opposite. Influence is quiet, intelligence is subtle, and control often comes from invisibility. They can't measure what they can't see, can't predict what they can't understand, and can't stop what they don't realize is happening. By participating without revealing your strategy, by absorbing without reacting, by learning without announcing, you become the invisible force that shapes outcomes. They think they are the ones dictating events, but in reality, the entire scenario is already unfolding according to the map you've constructed in your mind. And when the realization finally hits them, it hits like a shockwave. They replay every interaction, every test, every assumption, trying to find where they lost control, trying to figure out what went wrong. But the truth is simple. They were outmaneuvered from the very beginning, without knowing it. Their attempts to measure you, to push you, to provoke you, only fed the strategic advantage you quietly built. Every attack, every manipulation, every whispered plan became a stepping stone for your mastery of the situation. By the time they notice the shift, the game has already changed, the advantage is already yours, and the experiment they thought they were running was never theirs to begin